Hello everyone, tonight we're talking about seashells that once ran an economy and still outlast empires. Yes, not gold, not silver, but clams. From purple beads worth more than bread, to treaties woven into belts that could outlive governments, to colonists paying their taxes with mollusk cylinders while pretending they were civilized. The story of Wampum is one part finance, one part diplomacy, and one part existential comedy. So, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy falling asleep to the strangest footnotes of history. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. I like imagining this little circle of us, awake at odd hours, wandering through forgotten worlds together. Now, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself something warm, and let the hum of your room turn into the background of an older rhythm. Shells clicking softly, fire crackling, voices reciting agreements in the dark. Let's begin. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. And don't worry, it's not glamorous. You wouldn't be striding into Wall Street with cufflinks and a Rolex. You'd be crouched on a beach in what's now called Rhode Island, prying open a clam with hands raw from salt water, desperately hoping this one has the right shade of shell. Congratulations. You've just stepped into the original economy of beads wampum, and the stock market here isn't built on gold bars. It's built on mollusks. The prized material came from quahog clams, those thick-shelled purple and white creatures that don't exactly scream treasure chest, but held more value than you'd think. Purple beads were the rare gems, cut from that deep band of color inside the shell. White came from whelks, those spiral sea snails. White was fine, but purple, that was status, that was edge. If you were carrying strings heavy on purple, you were basically walking into the council like a human credit rating of excellent. Now, before you picture some cozy jewelry-making workshop, remember the process was brutal. You had to chip, grind, and polish those shells into beads by hand, using stone tools that had all the efficiency of a butter knife on granite. One bead could take days. That's days of sanding a tiny clam cylinder until your fingers blistered, just so someone in a council could one day hold it up and say, "This proves my point." By the time you finished a belt, you'd aged. No, really. Archaeologists find grooves worn into teeth from people holding shell blanks in their mouths while they worked them. Wampum wasn't just a craft, it was body-altering labor. And here's the twist that makes modern money look embarrassingly cheap. Value wasn't just in the raw material, but in the human effort pressed into it. Every bead carried the ghost of hours spent grinding shell against stone. Unlike coins stamped from a mint, where you blink and they're done, each bead was an artifact of patience, stubbornness, and probably a lot of swearing at uncooperative clams. Once finished, the beads were strung into long cords or woven into belts. And here's where it gets deliciously ironic. These belts were valuable. Yes, but not because anyone was rushing to a marketplace yelling, "I'll trade you 2 belts for a goat." No, their real power was symbolic, political, and ceremonial. They looked like jewelry, but they functioned as language. Each strand, each pattern, was less pretty accessory and more signed contract that you can wear around your neck. Picture it. Purple beads alternating with white in geometric sequences. To outsiders, it might look like fashion. To those who knew, it was as precise as legal code. These weren't random ornaments. They were documents in shell. And when someone handed you a string heavy on purple, they weren't just being generous, they were binding you to memory, obligation, history. So yes, if you had been born into this world, your net worth wasn't measured in coins or cash. It was in the purple gleam of quahog beads strung into cords that doubled as credit, treaty, and moral reminder. And here's the eerie part. The clams didn't just feed you, they spoke for you. Your future, your reputation, your political obligations, all trapped inside the polished skeletons of shellfish. And if you're already wondering how on earth someone read a string of beads like it was a contract, well, that brings us to the next chapter, where memory itself was stitched into wampum. If you thought the magic of wampum was in how pretty it looked when finished, let me ruin the romance for you. It was misery to make. Remember that polished bead I told you about? The one that looks like it belongs on a necklace? That's not a bead. That's a scar in bead form. It cost someone hours, sometimes days, of scraping clamshell against stone until both shell and sanity wore down evenly. Let me put you in the position. Imagine you're hunched over a rock, holding a fragment of shell. You're grinding it, over and over. Nothing changes for hours, except your spine curvature. Finally, you start shaping a cylinder. You think you're close, but you're not, because next, you need a hole through the middle, and drilling holes in shell with stone tools makes modern torture methods look merciful. You twist, you scrape, you pray the bead doesn't crack in half after 3 days of labor. If it does, congratulations, you've just produced the world's most disappointing gravel. Before Europeans showed up, everything was done with stone drills, sandstone files, and the kind of patience only people who don't yet have Netflix could possibly muster. After contact, when metal awls and drills arrived, production sped up. Yes, but here's the kicker. It didn't cheapen the meaning. It just meant more beads could circulate. The symbolism, the weight of labor, the cultural backbone remained intact. A bead made with steel wasn't fake. It was simply more efficient misery. And don't think just anyone could do it. Wampum making was centered in coastal communities, especially in what's now southern New England. It wasn't in every family activity. You needed access to the right shells, the right tools, the right techniques passed down like a guarded recipe. Outsiders didn't just wake up one morning and think, I'll make myself some wampum. No. The learning curve was steep enough to break most learners before their first finished string. The purple beads, the truly prized ones, were particularly tricky. That deep violet strip inside the quahog shell was narrow, hard, and unforgiving. Cutting it meant wasting most of the shell just to get to the good stuff. It was the filet mignon of shellcraft, precious because most of the clam wasn't usable. That's why purple outranked white. Not because people preferred the color for aesthetics, but because anyone who made purple beads basically sacrificed twice the effort and material. It wasn't purple equals pretty, it was purple equals pain, and the effort shows in archaeology. Sites littered with broken bead fragments tell the real story. For every perfect cylinder that ended up strung on a belt, dozens shattered mid-process. Wampum was a currency of survival, not just for its users but for its makers. Every bead was a gamble. Would the shell split? Would the hole break through crooked? Would you waste days only to end up with garbage? And here's the poetic part. That uncertainty, that blood and blister labor, became part of wampum's value. Because when someone handed you a string, they weren't just giving you a handful of pretty shells. They were giving you proof that someone, somewhere, had invested bone-deep hours into sanding, drilling, polishing. It wasn't just wealth, it was embodied time. Of course, once you've got your string of beads, the real trick wasn't just making them, it was knowing what they meant, which is where things get even stranger, because these weren't just trinkets to admire. They were documents, contracts, and histories you couldn't put in a filing cabinet. You wore them, displayed them, and most importantly, you remembered them. And that leads us right into how wampum became an archive of memory. So you've got your string of wampum, purple and white gleaming in the sun. You might think, finally, some ancient pocket change. Wrong. If you were hoping to stroll into a market and swap 2 strings for a basket of corn, you're going to starve. Because wampum wasn't about shopping lists, it was about relationships. You weren't holding money. You were holding memory, obligation, reputation. Think of it like this. In a gift-based economy, things don't circulate because they have a price. They circulate because they stitch people together. When you gave wampum, you weren't paying someone off. You were binding them closer. A string wasn't a receipt. It was a promise. And promises, unlike coins, come with expectations. Refuse to honor them. And it wasn't just your credit score that tanked. It was your whole standing in the community. And here's the darkly funny part. Coins, they're impersonal. They don't care if you're generous or stingy. Wampum, on the other hand, cared deeply. If you handed someone a belt, the community remembered it. You were announcing to the world, I acknowledge you, I'm tied to you. And yes, now we both have to show up at each other's funerals. Try opting out. You couldn't. Social gravity was as binding as the shells themselves. This wasn't a world of free market individualism. It was a world where the beadwork carried the weight of kinship. Wealth wasn't hoarded under lock and key. It moved, visibly, publicly, ceremonially. The more it moved, the more powerful it became. If you had wampum sitting untouched in a chest, it was basically dead. Only when it circulated, when it bound you into treaties, gifts, obligations, did it come alive. Imagine if today's richest billionaires had to prove their worth, not by stock portfolios, but by how many times they showed up, strings in hand, to actually honor commitments. society would collapse before breakfast. Now, there's something almost eerie about the way these beads made relationships stick. If you gave wampum to settle a dispute, it wasn't just apology accepted. The string or belt itself embodied the agreement. From then on, it could be displayed as proof. Remember this. You agreed to stop stealing my fishing grounds. See these purple beads? They say so. Break the agreement, and you weren't just betraying a neighbor. You were violating a material, visible, shell-bound record of your word. And that's the trick. It wasn't about wealth. It was about accountability. Each bead was like a witness that followed you around silently, reminding everyone of what you owed and what you promised. You could ignore a coin. You couldn't ignore a woven belt brought out in front of the council, with elders nodding gravely as the terms were recited. Try saying, "I forgot." The belt was right there, purple and white, laughing at you. So yes, wampum had value, but not the kind you could tally in ledgers. It was priceless in the most literal sense. Its worth wasn't set by markets, but by the web of obligations and trust that it carried across time. And the fact that it couldn't be reduced to numbers made it terrifyingly powerful. It wasn't money you could spend, it was memory you couldn't escape. Which raises the next unsettling question: how do you actually read a string of beads? Because if the real wealth wasn't in what you could buy, but in what you could remember, then wampum wasn't just currency at all. It was an archive, and an archive you wore around your waist or carried in your hands. So here's where things get strange. You've been picturing wampum as some kind of shiny necklace, maybe the ancient equivalent of a checking account. But let me stop you right there. What you're actually holding isn't jewelry, it's a text. A belt of shells was, in its own way, a library, a contract, and a speech rolled into one. If you thought paperwork today was tedious, imagine it made from thousands of hand-drilled clam beads and stored not in a cabinet but in the collective memory of your community. Let's put you inside the scene. A council gathers. An agreement has to be made. Instead of pulling out a pen, someone unfurls a wampum belt across the floor. The pattern of purple and white isn't just decorative, it's the outline of the treaty. But the real record isn't silent. A speaker recites the meaning aloud. The beads are prompts, like chapter headings, cues for memory. Together, belt and voice weave the law into being. No belt, the words are just words. With the belt, the words harden into history. That's how the Haudenosaunee remembered their great law of peace, the foundation of one of the most sophisticated indigenous political confederacies on the continent. Belts captured the structure of the law, but only as mnemonic keys. The knowledge lived in people, not in objects. The belts were like passwords. They unlocked the right story, the right obligations. Without the oral recitation, you had nothing more than a pretty string. With it, you had an archive that could outlast lifetimes. And here's the unsettling part. Unlike the paper contracts you're used to, these records couldn't be forged in the dark. A belt's meaning only existed when brought out in public, spoken, affirmed. That meant everyone present became a witness. A belt wasn't some private deed signed in triplicate. It was a performance, an embodied, ritualized act of remembering. You couldn't hide behind it. You had to stand with it. That made wampum terrifyingly binding. If a community handed you a belt, they weren't just giving you an object. They were giving you a story everyone knew you now had to carry. The belt stayed as a physical reminder, yes, but the obligation was alive in the heads of every elder who heard it recited. Break your word later, and the belt itself could be brought out like an incriminating witness, strings dangling in silent judgment. Some belts held single agreements, a treaty between neighbors, the settlement of a feud. Others, like the famous Hiawatha belt, carried the story of entire confederacies, their symbols woven into patterns meant to be recited for centuries. Imagine a constitution not scribbled in ink, but drilled into clamshell and memorized in chant. And you thought memorizing your Wi-Fi password was stressful. So yes, wampum was an archive, but an archive that breathed. It didn't sit dead in a drawer. It was taken out, spoken, handled, sung. It traveled. It was displayed during councils. It was touched and seen so its memory didn't fade. That's the eerie beauty. Knowledge didn't live in objects or in people alone. It lived in the space between the dialogue that belts sparked when voices rose around them. And if you're thinking, well, that's ceremonial, not practical, let me assure you, it was both. Because the next time neighboring nations sat down to negotiate war or peace, the belts came back out. And this is where Wampum really flexed its power. In diplomacy, where it wasn't just memory, it was law in motion. Now, let's imagine you're not some random shell grinder anymore. You've climbed the ladder. You're sitting in a longhouse, firelight flickering, the smell of smoke in your clothes, and all the serious faces around you are waiting. This isn't a family dinner, this is politics. Someone stands, unfurls a wampum belt, and suddenly the room goes quiet. You've just entered the world where clamshells decide war and peace. Here's the thing. In indigenous diplomacy, wampum wasn't a fancy accessory to seal the deal. It was the deal. When two nations wanted to make peace, they didn't just shake hands and hope for the best. They exchanged belts. The belt was the memory, the oath, the receipt, and the constitution rolled into one. Refuse to accept a belt, and you weren't just saying no to a treaty. You were saying no to the relationship itself. Accept the belt, and you were bound, not by ink on parchment, but by shells that everyone in the room understood as living proof. The two-row wampum, or guswenta, is a perfect example. Picture it, two parallel purple lines running down the length of the belt, separated by white. Those lines told a story, one for the Haudenosaunee canoe, one for the Dutch ship, the white in between. That was the promise. The two paths would never cross or interfere, but travel side by side, in peace, forever. It was elegant, simple, and devastatingly clear. Compare that to modern treaties written in legalese, so dense that even lawyers pretend to understand them. One look at the two-row, and you got the point. And treaties weren't just grand gestures, they were practical. A belt given during alliance talks might spell out terms, mutual defense, shared hunting grounds, or even trade arrangements. When a foreign envoy arrived, he didn't bring a folder of papers stamped with wax. He carried wampum strings. They were the credentials, the signal that he wasn't just speaking for himself, but carried the voice of his nation. No beads, no legitimacy. You could shout your proposal all day, but without wampum, you were basically a guy yelling in the dark. Here's the biting irony. Centuries later, when Europeans signed written treaties with native nations, they often treated the wampum as symbolic fluff, something pretty for the ceremony. But for the nations who gave them, the wampum was the real treaty. The paper was the fluff. That's why, when disputes arose, native leaders didn't pull out documents. They pulled out belts. They held them up in council and recited, "Here's what was agreed. Here's what you accepted." And often, Europeans were left stammering, because the written text they relied on didn't line up with what the belts preserved. In this way, wampum outlived the paper. Belts survived where documents burned or were misplaced in colonial archives. They're still brought out today in legal and political contexts, as living testimony to agreements made generations ago. Imagine trying to wriggle out of a promise when an object 400 years old gets placed on the table, and everyone in the room nods like, "Yes, we remember this." So in diplomacy, wampum wasn't a footnote, it was the backbone. It was how promises became visible, how nations made memory stick. And once you realize that, you start to see why it wasn't just about politics. It was also about healing, about repairing the social fabric after grief tore holes in it. Because wampum didn't just make treaties, it made condolence possible. So, picture this, a chief has died. The fire in the council house feels colder, the political air hangs heavy, and the people can't move forward until something crucial happens. In the Haudenosaunee world, grief wasn't a private inconvenience, it was a political emergency. Why? Because the death of a leader cracked the entire framework of governance, and the tool to mend that crack, not parchment, not speeches, but wampum. Enter the condolence ceremony. Strings of wampum weren't there to decorate the funeral. They were used to literally wipe away tears, to metaphorically clear the ears so the grieving could hear again, to open the throat so they could speak once more. It sounds poetic, almost delicate, but don't be fooled, it was also deadly serious statecraft. Until the ceremony happened, the council couldn't function. Alliances hung in limbo, and decisions stalled. In other words, no wampum, no government. Now, imagine you're there, sitting through it. A speaker holds up strings of beads one by one, reciting words of condolence with each. The shells aren't just props, they're active tools in the process of healing. They give shape to the words, weight to the promises, proof that mourning has been acknowledged. Without them, grief stays raw, politics stays paralyzed, and chaos looms. You thought therapy was expensive. Try governing an entire confederacy with seashells and memory as your only medicine. And here's the eerie irony. Those strings didn't just patch up sorrow, they also authorized the transfer of power. When a chief died, a successor had to be chosen. But you couldn't just name the replacement and move on. That would be like changing the batteries in your smoke alarm while the house was still on fire. The community had to first heal the wound of grief through wampum before political life could restart. Only then could the successor step in, legitimized by ceremony, cleansed of the lingering weight of loss. That meant wampum was both spiritual and bureaucratic at the same time. It was grief counseling and government paperwork rolled into one. Without those beads, the machinery of law and alliance froze. With them, the gears turned again, which is why condolence strings weren't optional. They were the hidden lubrication of the political system, the oil that kept the Confederacy from grinding itself into silence every time a leader died. Think about that. In societies where law wasn't written down but lived in the voices of leaders, death wasn't just sad, it was destabilizing. And wampum was the strange, beautiful fix. It made mourning a collective duty, a step toward political renewal, and a reminder that governance itself had to be rooted in compassion. Try telling that to modern politicians and see how fast they laugh you out of the room. But in that world, shells did more than heal grief. They carried legitimacy. They reminded leaders that they weren't lone figures of power, but strands woven into a wider web. And once you start to see that, it becomes clear that wampum wasn't just about memory or mourning. It was about authority itself. Which brings us neatly to how those beads could make or break the legitimacy of every single word spoken in council. So you've wiped the tears, the new chief is in place, and the council is ready to resume business. But here's the catch. Words alone aren't enough. You can't just stroll into the longhouse, say, "Hey, trust me," and expect anyone to believe you. Authority here doesn't come from titles and letterhead. It comes from wampum. No beads, no voice. You could be the smoothest talker alive, but without that string in your hand, you're just noise in the wind. Messengers carried wampum as their passport. A string wasn't a decoration dangling from the wrist. It was the proof that you were speaking for a nation. Without it, you weren't an envoy. You were a trespasser. Picture it. You walk in, announce some grand proposal, and then the council asks, "Where's your string?" If your hand is empty, your credibility evaporates faster than water on hot stones. The shells were your credential, your badge, your very right to open your mouth. And once you spoke with wampum in hand, those words didn't just vanish into air, they stuck. They gained weight. A string placed down during speech was like underlining a sentence in stone. Later, when memory blurred, the belt or string could be brought back out. See, this was said, this was accepted, this was promised. Without it, anyone could claim you lied, misheard, or simply invented things after the fact. With it, the council had physical evidence, silent but undeniable, and the protocols were sharp. He didn't just wave beads around randomly. Every string had a purpose. Some validated the messenger's presence, others authenticated the words spoken, still others bound agreements. Imagine trying to keep track of that without slipping up. Deliver the wrong string, and you might as well show up at the United Nations with a karaoke machine instead of a speech. The eerie part. These shells were like truth serum. If you lied while holding a belt, you weren't just dishonorable, you were dangerous. You risked unraveling the delicate web of trust that held entire confederacies together. And everyone knew it. The beads amplified your words, yes, but they also amplified the consequences. A lie tethered to wampum didn't fade, it festered. Now think of the irony. In a world where we drown in signatures, stamps, and notarized seals, these nations relied on shells drilled by hand, carried across forests, recited in council fires, and it worked. Because the legitimacy wasn't locked in paper, it was locked in protocol, in the knowledge that everyone present knew the rules and respected them. Break those rules, and you didn't just damage yourself, you damaged the very cosmos of alliances. So, if you had been that messenger, clutching your string as you spoke, you'd have felt the weight, not just of shells, but of reputation, law, and the silent judgment of every elder in the room. And that weight, oddly enough, wasn't about personal wealth. It was about how well you embodied responsibility, which is why wampum could never just be money. It was far too personal, too embedded in ethics. And speaking of ethics, let's not pretend these beads only lived in politics. They spilled over into ceremony, status, and the subtle moral code of how to live in a world where every exchange mattered. So here's the awkward truth. In a world of wampum, wealth wasn't measured by how much you could hoard, but by how much you could give away without looking like a selfish fool. If you thought modern social media was brutal in judging people, imagine living in a society where your entire status depended on how responsibly you handled beads made from clams. One stingy move, and congratulations, you're now that guy, and not in a good way. Picture yourself as a leader walking into a council. If you kept wampum hidden in your dwelling, untouched and unused, people didn't whisper, "Wow, what a rich man." They whispered, "Why is he hoarding like a miser instead of strengthening ties?" The value wasn't in storage, but in circulation. You had to put those strings to work in gift-giving, condolence, treaty, and ceremony. Otherwise, your reputation grew mold faster than wet corn. Ceremonies amplified this social expectation. Wampum was displayed at feasts, exchanged in rites of passage, offered at weddings, and even used to honor visiting delegations. It was more than decor. Every string laid out was a statement. We are generous, we are bound to one another, and we respect the obligations that keep this world balanced. Try skipping that, and suddenly you weren't just cheap, you were spiritually suspect. And that's where ethics slipped in. Wampum carried a moral weight. To misuse it, to lie with it, to hoard it selfishly. These weren't little mistakes. They were cracks in your character. A belt could outlive you, and if your name became attached to one in shameful circumstances, well, that stuck too. Imagine your descendants having to sit in councils centuries later while people muttered, "Ah, yes, this belt tied to that ancestor of yours who broke every promise he ever made." Legacy in shell form, immortalized in regret. Of course, not all uses were grim reminders. Wampum could also elevate you. A person known for generosity with wampum, for honoring obligations without hesitation, wasn't just admired, they were trusted. And in societies where politics, spirituality, and kinship intertwined, trust was the closest thing to real power. You couldn't buy influence with wampum. You earned it by demonstrating that you knew how to move it responsibly. The eerie humor here is that these seashell beads, so fragile in your hand, were heavier in moral weight than gold ever managed to be in Europe. Gold could buy silence. Wampum demanded truth. Gold could isolate the wealthy. Wampum wove people together. Gold's greatest trick was to elevate the individual. Wampum's was to bury the individual inside a community of obligations. So if you'd been born into this system, you wouldn't dream of hiding your wampum in a chest for private comfort. You'd keep it moving, keep it visible, keep it binding, because the moment it stopped circulating, it stopped meaning. And the moment it stopped meaning, so did you. And yet, the irony deepens. For all this cultural and ethical weight, wampum wasn't trapped inside one community. It traveled across rivers, forests, and alliances, which is why, long before Europeans showed up, wampum had already become the lifeblood of trade networks stretching inland. By now, you've realized wampum wasn't just seashell bling. It was obligation, archive, and ethics braided into one. But here's the twist, it didn't stay put. Those little clam cylinders traveled farther than most of the people who made them, long before anyone carrying a musket or Bible set foot on the coast. Wampum had already threaded itself through vast trade networks, moving inland like a second river system across the continent. Imagine yourself in what's now upstate New York, hundreds of miles from the Atlantic. You've never seen a clam in your life. Yet, here you are, running your fingers over purple and white beads, strung neatly into a belt. They've been carried to you by traders trekking forest trails, paddling rivers, exchanging shells for furs, food, or other goods along the way. To you, these beads don't smell of salt water. They smell of diplomacy, ceremony, continuity. They are exotic, rare, and loaded with meaning, precisely because they've traveled so far. The production hubs were coastal, southern New England, Long Island, Rhode Island, places where quahogs and whelks were plentiful. But inland nations like the Haudenosaunee weren't cut off from this resource. They became masters of redistribution, incorporating wampum into their political life and radiating it outward again. That's why archaeologists find wampum strands hundreds of kilometers from the ocean. They weren't trinkets traded once. They were arteries of relationship, constantly moving. And here's the ironic part. These trade systems didn't need the logic of currency to work. Nobody stood on a riverbank shouting, 2 strings for a beaver pelt. Final offer. Exchanges were woven into social fabrics, obligations, reciprocal expectations. Wampum simply made those connections portable. It was the USB drive of a world without paperwork. You could carry agreements, gifts, condolences, and legitimacy downriver, and everyone who received it would know how to read it. But don't mistake this for a free-for-all. Not everyone could just crank out wampum and flood the market. Production was specialized. Certain coastal peoples had both the resources and the know-how to drill beads at scale. Inland groups valued them precisely because they couldn't make them easily themselves. That scarcity reinforced their weight. When wampum arrived, it wasn't casual. It had traveled, it had been worked, it had been embedded in layers of exchange before it ever reached your hands. This circulation also built trust. If you accepted wampum from a trading partner, you weren't just taking shells. You were taking responsibility for the relationship, with all the memory and accountability those beads carried. That's why they could travel so far without losing meaning, because every stop on their journey layered them with more context, more connections, more stories. And when Europeans finally stumbled into the picture, dazzled by their own ideas of currency, they thought they'd discovered a convenient little money system waiting to be exploited. They weren't wrong that wampum could move, circulate, and standardize exchange. But they were very wrong about what it meant. For indigenous nations, wampum wasn't just small change, it was big meaning. Still, colonial hunger for coins would twist things. And before long, wampum found itself drafted into a role it was never built to play. The official currency of strangers who thought they could legislate its value like they were stamping pennies. And here's where the story takes a wonderfully absurd turn. Imagine Europeans arriving on the northeastern coast, pockets jangling with exactly 0 coins because the colonies were perpetually starved of cash. They stumble across these polished clam beads circulating everywhere, and instead of asking too many questions, they basically go, perfect. Seashells are money now. So yes, for a stretch of the 17th century, wampum became legal tender in Dutch New Netherland and later in English New England. Colonial governments set official rates, so many beads to a stuver, so many to a penny. Purple was rated higher than white because even Europeans could recognize that labor and scarcity mattered. For a moment, the dream of clam-based capitalism was real. You could pay your taxes with wampum. You could buy bread, liquor, even land. Picture a merchant counting out strings of purple and white beads in place of silver coins. It sounds like satire, but it was law. Of course, Europeans never really understood what they were copting. To them, wampum was a convenient stopgap in a cash-starved economy. To indigenous nations, it remained what it had always been: treaty, memory, obligation. So when colonists handed over a string of beads thinking they'd just bought a pig, the recipient might interpret that exchange as sealing an ongoing relationship. One side thought they'd made a transaction. The other side thought they'd entered an alliance. You can guess how well that ended. And here's the kicker. Colonists tried to standardize wampum like it was coin. They legislated bead size, color, and quality. Strings of poorly made beads were discounted. Local courts debated what counted as acceptable tender. Imagine a judge in 1637 squinting at a string of beads and declaring it subpar because the holes weren't centered. It was finance meets craft critique, but it worked for a while. Wampum helped grease the gears of colonial trade when metal coin was scarce. It flowed through markets, across frontiers, into tax coffers. For a brief moment in history, New York and Boston quite literally ran on shellfish. Still, there was a fatal flaw. Europeans didn't respect the cultural rules that made wampum meaningful. They treated it like a commodity, not a covenant. Once they figured out they could mass-produce beads with metal drills, the whole system sagged under its own weight. More beads flooded the market, quality declined, counterfeits appeared, and just like with paper money printed too fast, inflation set in. By the late 1600s, wampum's credibility as colonial currency crumbled, replaced by coins imported from across the ocean. Yet here's the irony that should keep you up at night. Europeans could walk away from wampum as money, but indigenous nations never walked away from it as memory. For them, it was never just a stand-in for coinage. It remained sacred law, political legitimacy, a thread binding past to present. So while colonists dropped their beads into oblivion, Councils still unrolled belts centuries later, still reciting, still remembering. So if you had been born in that world, you might have watched your shells morph into money in one breath and back into treaty in the next. And if you thought that contradiction was messy, just wait until you see what happened when too many beads flooded the system. When inflation, fakes, and mass production stripped wampum of its colonial shine. Once Europeans decided wampum was money, you just knew they couldn't leave it alone. They had to standardize it, regulate it, measure it, and ruin it with paperwork. So picture some Dutch bureaucrat in New Amsterdam, quill in hand, declaring that purple beads are officially worth twice as much as white ones. Not because of cultural meaning, mind you, simply because rarity and labor finally made sense to them when framed in terms of supply and demand. Congratulations, the first colonial exchange rate had just been set by a man who probably couldn't drill a bead to save his life. Colonial governments passed laws to define bead quality. They legislated the size of the hole, the polish of the surface, the uniformity of shape. Too rough, too irregular, discounted. Entire shipments of wampum could be declared worthless if some official decided the beads were sloppy. Imagine having your hard-earned wages rejected because your boss thought your money was ugly. That was life in clamshell capitalism. And because officials hated ambiguity, they imposed limits. In Massachusetts, wampum was only legal tender up to a certain amount. Beyond that, no beads. You could pay your taxes in shells, but only small ones, metaphorically speaking. The really big transactions, those still required the precious metal coins no one actually had. It was like trying to run an economy on loose change, while the gold stayed locked up overseas. But here's where it gets both absurd and revealing. For indigenous nations, the very idea of quality control missed the point. A bead didn't fail because it was asymmetrical. A bead carried meaning because of the labor and relationship invested in it. Yet Europeans reduced it to commodity standards, uniform size, neat finish, market value. They stripped away its soul to measure its worth. And once you introduce standards, you introduce loopholes. Traders began cutting corners. Beads made with steel drills flooded the market. They were faster, cleaner, easier, and of course, devalued everything. Colonists argued endlessly about whether machine-drilled beads should count the same as hand-drilled ones. Meanwhile, indigenous communities carried on using wampum for diplomacy and ceremony, unimpressed by the colonial obsession with neat holes and straight edges. The irony here is delicious. Colonial courts spent more time arguing about shell quality than they did about honoring treaties. A belt that represented peace between nations could be brushed aside, while a crooked bead was treated like a financial scandal. Priorities, right. Still, the limits couldn't hold. Inflation crept in. Too many beads chased a few goods. Fraudsters created fakes from cheaper shells. The system cracked. By the 1660s, colonial leaders were already complaining that wampum wasn't good money anymore. They quietly phased it out, importing coins and pretending they hadn't just run a regional economy on clam guts for decades. But for indigenous nations, none of this mattered. The standards, the rates, the limits, all colonial noise. Wampum's power wasn't in exchange rates. It was in memory, legitimacy, ceremony. Europeans tried to make it currency. Native nations never stopped treating it as covenant. And that's why, when colonial markets abandoned wampum, the belts didn't vanish into attics. They stayed in council houses, still binding people to words spoken long before. Yet, once inflation and counterfeits flooded the system, wampum's short-lived career as official colonial money collapsed spectacularly. And that collapse tells us something crucial about how fragile value really is when you confuse meaning with price. If you thought shell-based capitalism could run forever, let me burst that bubble like an overboiled clam. The colonial wampum economy didn't just wobble, it inflated, collapsed, and face-planted spectacularly. And the cause was the same one that has haunted every human experiment with money. Too much of it. Remember how pre-contact wampum was painstakingly hand-drilled, each bead a tiny triumph of labor. That bottleneck kept supply low and value high. Enter steel drills, courtesy of European technology. Suddenly, what once took hours or days could be cranked out in minutes. Production skyrocketed. Beads flooded markets. What was once rare became common, and what was once precious began to look like cheap costume jewelry. But it gets worse. Europeans and opportunistic traders didn't just accelerate production, they started counterfeiting. They made beads from cheaper shells, sometimes dyed to mimic the prized purple quahog. Others were cranked out in such sloppy fashion that indigenous communities nicknamed them trash wampum. Imagine trying to pay rent in monopoly money and insisting it was close enough. Even colonists eventually had to admit the quality was gone, the trust evaporating, and with abundance came inflation. Colonial courts complained constantly that too many beads were circulating, their value dropping. One year, you could buy a loaf of bread with a string of white. The next year, you needed twice as much. It was the 17th century version of hyperinflation. Only instead of printing presses, the culprit was a frenzy of shell drilling workshops. Ironically, indigenous nations noticed the rot long before colonists did. Councils were increasingly wary of poor quality beads. Belts made with sloppy or counterfeit shells lost credibility in diplomatic contexts. Which is why, despite colonial whining about inflation, indigenous use of wampum never collapsed entirely. They simply insisted on quality, authentic quahog, carefully crafted, properly polished. In other words, the symbolic backbone remained intact, even as colonial markets buckled. By the 1660s, the writing was on the wall. Colonies like Massachusetts began to phase wampum out as official currency. Coins from Europe slowly trickled in, displacing shell money. By the end of the century, wampum had gone from legal tender to backup option to that embarrassing thing we used when we didn't have real cash. Colonists moved on, eager to forget they had once run an economy on mollusks. But let's pause for a moment on the sheer comedy of it. Imagine the pride of colonial officials, strutting about in wigs and breeches, while their entire treasury depended on clamshells imported from native producers. Imagine tax collectors grumbling about crooked beads, while pretending their empire was founded on order and reason. For a brief, shimmering period, the backbone of European colonial authority in North America was quite literally a pile of seashells. And then, predictably, they overdid it, cheapened it, and broke it. Yet here's the eerie twist. For indigenous nations, the collapse of wampum as colonial money was irrelevant. Wampum had never been money to them in the first place. It remained what it always was: treaty, condolence, memory. Colonists inflated it into coinage and then abandoned it like a bad experiment. But the belts remained in longhouses, still waiting to be spoken, still binding agreements centuries later. So, while European markets dropped wampum like yesterday's fashion, native nations never let go. And that resilience is what carried wampum into the modern era, not as a failed currency, but as a living covenant. So, the colonists have dropped their clam fetish. They've switched to coins, congratulated themselves for becoming civilized, and quietly buried the memory that their first taxes were collected in beads. But here's the thing, indigenous nations didn't blink. Wampum wasn't a fad for them. It never lived or died on market value. While colonial treasuries scrambled for silver, councils kept bringing out belts, kept reciting words, kept treating wampum as living law. Picture a Haudenosaunee council in the 18th century. The world is changing fast. Guns, rum, treaties on parchment, but when it's time to confirm agreements or settle disputes, the belts still come out. They're unrolled carefully, patterns of purple and white shimmering in firelight, while an orator recites their meaning. Nobody in that room is thinking about exchange rates. They're thinking about obligations, about memory, about what was promised and what must still be honored. That's the eerie beauty. While European markets inflated and collapsed, wampum held steady in its original role. You couldn't counterfeit meaning. A bead drilled sloppily or dyed the wrong color might wreck its value as currency. But in ceremony, the integrity of the pattern and the truth of the words mattered most. You can't fake trust with a crooked bead when an entire community is there to call you out. And continuity meant adaptability. Wampum kept marking key transitions, condolence ceremonies after leaders' deaths, alliances between nations, even internal debates about law and governance. Belts weren't static museum pieces. They were performed, spoken, made present. Every time a belt was unfurled, its story re-entered the living memory of the people. Think of it as a constitution that never sat on a shelf. It had to be reenacted regularly to stay alive. Even in the colonial courts, indigenous leaders kept bringing belts as evidence. When they reminded colonial officials of promises, they didn't waive documents. They held up wampum belts became, in effect, indigenous exhibits in legal disputes, forcing Europeans to reckon with a system of accountability they couldn't control. That's why some of the most famous belts, like the two-row wampum or the Covenant chain belts, are still cited today in political negotiations. The treaties may have been signed on paper, but the living version survived in shell. Meanwhile, within indigenous societies, wampum remained woven into everyday ethical life. It didn't vanish because colonists abandoned it. It endured because it was never just about trade. Belts could still be given at funerals, marriages, and ceremonies of reconciliation. They kept teaching history, binding relationships, and transmitting obligations. Colonists might dismiss them as beads, but communities saw them as archives that breathed and spoke when recited. So if you'd been living then, you would have seen a strange double life. To Europeans, wampum faded into quaint curiosity, a relic of savages they pretended to outgrow. To indigenous nations, wampum was still the foundation of governance and memory. And that gap, that refusal to see wampum for what it really was, is exactly why misunderstandings piled up for centuries. And those misunderstandings grew into something worse, myths and misconceptions. Because once colonists forgot wampum's true role, they started reducing it to a caricature, Indian money, a phrase that misses the point entirely. Here's where we pause for a reality check. Because history, and especially textbooks written by people who never touched a clam in their lives, has left a mess of misconceptions about wampum. The biggest one, that it was just Indian money, neat, tidy, and completely wrong. Reducing wampum to currency is like saying Shakespeare was just a guy who sold paper. Yes, Europeans briefly used wampum as cash, but for indigenous nations, its value was never in how many loaves of bread or mugs of rum it could buy. Wampum was law, archive, and obligation. Calling it money ignores the fact that you couldn't just hand someone a belt and say, "That'll be 10 potatoes. The moment you tried that, the other person would look at you like you'd just suggested paying rent with a family photo album. Another misconception, that wampum was purely decorative, little more than pretty jewelry. This one's especially stubborn, thanks to centuries of colonial collectors who put belts in glass cases and admired them for their patterns while ignoring the words they carried. To treat wampum as decoration is like hanging the Magna Carta on your wall and calling it interior design. The designs weren't aesthetic accidents. They were language, encoding agreements that required performance to remain alive. Then there's the myth of primitive currency. European writers loved that phrase. It made them feel modern, progressive, superior, as if indigenous nations were just waiting for coins to show up so they could finally join the grown-ups. But here's the irony. Those same Europeans ran their colonies on wampum for decades when they didn't have coins. Who was primitive then? The nations with a functioning, shell-based system of memory and diplomacy, or the colonists begging for beads to pay their taxes? A more subtle misconception is the idea that wampum's power ended when colonial markets dropped it, that once it lost status as legal tender, it became irrelevant. In truth, its role as money was always secondary. Its real power, as treaty, condolence, legitimacy, never stopped. Belts kept being brought out in councils long after coins replaced them in markets, and they're still brought out today, making demands, carrying memory, binding agreements across centuries. And let's not forget the collectors and museums who treated wampum belts as artifacts without context, stripping them from communities and displaying them as if they were pretty trinkets from a lost world. In reality, wampum wasn't lost. It was stolen, silenced, and misunderstood. Belts are still being repatriated, still being read aloud, still functioning as living law. A belt behind glass is like a book you're not allowed to open. It looks impressive, but it's useless until its words are spoken. So, if you had been born into this world, you'd know that every time someone muttered Indian money, they were missing the entire point. You'd know that every bead carried layers of meaning, history, grief, promises that no market rate could ever capture. And you'd laugh, bitterly, at the irony that Europeans dismissed wampum as primitive, even while building their colonial survival on its back. But here's the thing, wampum isn't just history. It's not frozen in some sepia-toned past. which is why the final step in this story isn't about decline at all. It's about continuity into the present, where certain belts still define politics, identity, and justice. If you thought wampum belonged to dusty museum shelves, let me wake you gently. It's not dead, it's not primitive, and it never stopped speaking. Some belts remain central to indigenous political life today, so much so that they still get cited in courtrooms, councils, and international negotiations. Seashells outlasting empires, that's the punchline history doesn't want to admit. Take the Hiawatha belt. Its design is simple, a line of white beads connecting 5 symbols, each representing one of the original nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. At the center, a tree, the Great Tree of Peace. That belt isn't jewelry. It's a constitution woven in quahog and whelk, a living emblem of unity that continues to ground Haudenosaunee identity and governance. Imagine your country's founding document being wearable, portable, and regularly recited aloud. Now imagine it lasting centuries without amendments. That's the Hiawatha belt. Or look at the Turo Wampum Guswenta, arguably the most famous treaty belt in North America. 2 parallel purple lines separated by white, one for the Haudenosaunee canoe, one for the European ship. The meaning: we travel the river of life together, but neither steers the other's vessel. Mutual respect, non-interference, sovereignty. It was presented to the Dutch in 1613. And here's the eerie part. It still gets invoked today in discussions about indigenous rights and land. A 400-year-old promise in shell form, dragged into modern politics because, unlike the paper versions Europeans filed away, this one never stopped being remembered. Other belts mark specific treaties, alliances, or condolence rituals. Some were carried to Washington in the 18th century. Others remained in longhouses, used in ceremonies well into the 20th century. And many are now subjects of repatriation movements, as indigenous communities demand the return of belts locked in museum vaults. Because without being spoken, without being recited, a belt is silenced, and silencing is exactly what colonialism tried to do. But the belts endure. They surface at legal challenges, at commemorations, at cultural revivals. They are reminders that indigenous nations didn't just sign away sovereignty with paper treaties. They recorded their own version of events in wampum, and those records still stand as counter-narratives, as binding testimonies. If history is a courtroom, then wampum is still evidence, and it refuses to be struck from the record. And here's the irony worth savoring. The same Europeans who once treated wampum as money to patch up their coin shortages now see those same belts used as legal and political instruments against their own descendants, governments. Seashells as instruments of sovereignty. Try laughing that off. So if you had been born into this world, you'd know that wampum was never a fad, never a trinket, never just a necklace. It was, and still is, law in motion, history you can hold, memory woven into beadwork, a reminder that meaning doesn't vanish just because one culture decides it's no longer convenient. And the next time you see a belt behind glass in a museum, think about it. That isn't an artifact. That's a voice, temporarily muted, waiting for the right moment to be spoken again. Because wampum never stopped being alive. It's the rest of us who forgot how to listen. Shells, at first glance, hardly look like history's chosen diplomats. They're fragile, small, and easy to lose in the sand. And yet, across centuries and oceans, they became tokens of authority, reminders of promises, and even anchors of peace. What began as glittering fragments picked up from a shoreline turned into a language of alliances, not because they were pretty, though that helped, but because they carried the shimmer of permanence where words alone dissolved. People, as it turns out, needed something to hold on to when a treaty was made, and shells offered just enough durability to outlast the shaking of hands, or whatever equivalent ritual was in place before handshakes were invented. The irony was that their very uselessness in practical terms made them perfect for meaning. You couldn't eat them, you couldn't cut down a tree with them, and you couldn't forge a weapon out of them. That's precisely why they survived in the space of ritual. A string of shells could be passed between groups without anyone worrying it would be spent on food or broken down into tools. In fact, it's their lack of immediate function that let them travel so far, gathering significance with every exchange. And it's in this drift from ornament to obligation that shells ceased to be mere decoration and became repositories of trust, shimmering under torchlight like the bones of an agreement. They gleamed in a way stone and bone never could. The surface of a shell carried that soft, pearly sheen. Not exactly gold, not quite silver, but something stranger, like moonlight, trapped in solid form. Their durability mattered, of course, but what sealed their fate as diplomatic tools was how resistant they were to decay. A piece of fish vanishes in hours, wood cracks in damp air, but a shell, it can endure centuries of handling, its ridges wearing smooth against countless palms. That made them reliable. A treaty needed a body, and shells refused to die easily. Rarity helped too. Certain shells came only from waters far away, forcing communities to stretch their networks if they wanted to acquire them. In that sense, the shells already embodied the alliance before they were even exchanged. A coastal people trading with an inland group, carrying fragments of the sea across deserts or forests. Every step added weight to their value. To hold one was not just to hold an object, but a chain of journeys. A geography collapsed into your hand. And they were portable, which mattered more than one might think. Unlike cattle, which can be stolen, or land, which can't move at all, shells tucked neatly into pouches and string bags, their lightness betraying the enormous social gravity they carried. An agreement can't survive if it's too heavy to travel. Shells solved that problem with uncanny elegance. They became not just symbols, but the very infrastructure of memory. And memory, in this form, wasn't abstract. It was textured, colored, and always close enough to touch, which leads to another peculiarity. Once shells carried weight, they also began to carry stories, entire genealogies woven through their ridges. The object stopped being just itself, and started to stand in for the lives and promises it represented. A treaty whispered into the air vanishes with the breath that carried it, but a treaty strung into a necklace or pressed into a basket of shells lingers. That was the quiet genius of using shells. They didn't just represent memory, they stored it. Each ridge, each polished curve could be pointed to as evidence, a tangible reminder of who gave what, when, and under what circumstances. In societies where words were powerful but fleeting, shells became archives that no scribe had to maintain. This wasn't metaphorical. People really did trace lineages, debts, and alliances through shell objects. A strand could recall a marriage bond, a reconciliation after bloodshed, or the founding of a trading partnership. To possess it was to hold history, not in the abstract way we clutch at myths, but in the way one keeps receipts. And the beauty of it all was that the meaning didn't stay frozen. As shells circulated, new stories stuck to them like barnacles. They became palimpsests, reminders not only of the first promise but of every hand that had carried them since. Of course, this gave them a kind of eerie authority. Breaking a treaty meant more than just betraying someone's trust. It meant violating the physical embodiment of memory. To deny the shell was to deny the past itself, and that was a dangerous form of amnesia. People remembered, and the shells forced them to. They were, in a way, the most portable courts in the world, humming with silent verdicts. From this embedding of memory into matter, it was only a short step into ritual, where shells ceased to be mere records and became active participants in the ceremonies that bound people together. When the moment came to bind groups together, the exchange was rarely a quiet affair. Shells entered ritual with the drama of theater, drums, chants, dancing bodhis, and the slow unveiling of strings or baskets that had traveled across distances. To give shells wasn't a simple handoff, it was choreography. They were carried on the chest, worn on the arms, or displayed in heaps, the glittering heart of a gathering that otherwise might have dissolved into suspicion. In marriage ceremonies, shells stitched two families together more firmly than vows alone. They shimmered as dowry, as guarantee, as evidence that this union wasn't just two people, but entire lineages pledging fidelity. In feasts, shells were paraded like edible wealth, except they couldn't be eaten, which was precisely the point. Their uselessness in the mouth turned them into nourishment for social bonds instead. And in the aftermath of conflict, when blood had already dried in the soil, shells were set down between leaders, their presence insisting that memory of violence could be transformed into obligation for peace. Every ritual infused them with weight far greater than their size. Once exchanged, a shell was no longer just a pretty fragment of ocean. It had absorbed the breath of dancers, the smoke of fires, the voices of elders. People People looked at them differently afterward, no longer mere objects, but vessels charged with the heat of collective performance. And from that stage, shells became the most trusted diplomats in disputes where words faltered. It's not surprising then that they slipped seamlessly into diplomacy proper, their quiet gleam doing what no sword could, turning enemies into uneasy partners. When strangers stood on the edge of hostility, it was often the shells that stepped forward first. They weren't waved like flags or stacked like gold bars, but brought out slowly, almost ceremonially, as if the object itself could negotiate better than the humans carrying it. A string of shells laid between rival groups was both promise and warning. Once accepted, it bound the parties in ways words couldn't. The treaty lived in the shells, and to ignore them was to invite both social and spiritual retribution. In parts of North America, belts woven from shells spelled out agreements in patterns that could be read like texts. The strands were more than decoration. They were documents, binding leaders not by signatures, but by a chain of gleaming fragments that resisted decay. Far across the ocean, in the Pacific, elaborate shell ornaments moved between clans as tokens of peace or partnership, their circulation carefully staged so that no one could forget who owed what to whom. These exchanges transformed the fragile into the indestructible. So long as the shells endured, the alliance did too. The effectiveness was almost eerie. To break a treaty wasn't just betrayal, it was sacrilege. People feared the invisible punishments attached to violating a shell agreement. Misfortune wasn't interpreted as chance, but as consequence. Crops failing, children falling ill, storms wrecking canoes. It wasn't paranoia. It was social memory enforcing itself with terrifying efficiency. The shells, in their silence, judged. Of course, once shells became the language of diplomacy, they had to move. And in moving, they built vast networks, binding distant communities together into webs of obligation and fragile trust. They traveled farther than most humans ever did. A shell pried from a reef in the tropics could end up dangling from the neck of someone living hundreds of miles inland, its shimmer carrying the salt of seas that person had never seen. This was the strange geography shells created. Rivers became highways, mountain passes became arteries, and suddenly entire regions were stitched together by the slow, deliberate movement of fragile objects. Trade routes weren't just about goods, they were about the relationships those goods demanded. Every time a shell crossed hands, a thread was knotted into a wider net of obligation. One group might pass it on during a marriage alliance, another in a peace offering, another in tribute to distant kin. The result was a circulation system where the shells themselves held a map of human connection. To trace their paths was to trace the skeleton of whole societies, and they weren't anonymous. Shells carried identities, reputations, histories. Owning a particular strand meant inheriting the alliances it had once sealed, the debts still attached to it, the obligations waiting to be honored. This made circulation a kind of slow-motion diplomacy. Even when people weren't negotiating face-to-face, the shells were negotiating for them, whispering across distance. It was in this constant circulation that the objects acquired their peculiar vitality. They seemed to move of their own accord, compelled to travel, to connect, to remind. Which is why, when they were finally displayed, they weren't tucked away in treasuries, but worn on bodies turned into living, walking testimonies of the treaties they embodied. The treaty didn't sit in a chest, it clinked against a collarbone. Shells weren't filed away like parchment, but threaded into necklaces, belts, pendants, treaties you could wear to the market or to a council fire. The body became the archive, every movement a reminder of the promises resting on your shoulders. A strand worn across the chest wasn't fashion, it was obligation shimmering in daylight. This had its practical genius. Unlike a stone, steely, or an inked contract, shells followed the body wherever it went. If you turned up at a feast, the shells arrived with you, visible proof that the words spoken months or years earlier still held. If you walked into enemy territory, a shell display announced before you even spoke that you weren't there as a stranger, but as someone bound by prior agreements. They transformed the body into a walking treaty, unmistakable and hard to dispute. And there was theater in the wearing. A leader heavy with shells wasn't just decorated, he was burdened, visibly weighted by alliances and promises, a body shimmering under social debt. People could count your obligations by the number of glistening fragments you carried, and in that accounting your authority was both affirmed and tested. Too many shells, and you looked powerful. but too many broken promises, and those same shells became accusations dangling in public view. In this way, shells blurred into law. To strip a man of his treaty shells was to strip him of legitimacy, a punishment far more humiliating than a fine. They weren't just accessories. They were verdicts you couldn't take off without consequence, which leads directly to the curious border they occupied between the sacred and the legal, where wearing shells meant living inside contracts that were part economy, part devotion, and part haunting. They lived in that ambiguous territory where money, law, and religion overlap so neatly you can't quite tell them apart. Shells weren't coins, though Europeans kept mistaking them for that. They were closer to contracts that pulsed with spiritual authority, half currency, half curse, depending on how you treated them. When shells moved between hands, they didn't just mark an exchange, they summoned the invisible eyes of ancestors and spirits to witness it. That made every transaction less about trade and more about testimony. The legal weight was obvious. A shell could enforce a debt with more bites than a written contract because it didn't rely on courts. It relied on collective belief. Fail to honor the agreement tied to a shell, and it wasn't just your partner you betrayed, but the entire invisible order that bound your world together. You couldn't litigate against misfortune. After all, a harvest rotting, a canoe capsizing, a child struck with illness. These were judgments carried out without trial. The penalty for a broken pact. At the same time, the shells were sacred. Their origins from the sea or river imbued them with a kind of elemental authority. Water, the boundary between worlds, had coughed them up, and so they carried whispers of permanence. To hold one was to hold a fragment of that liminal zone where humans touched the divine. No wonder they became the instruments through which both law and ritual could be enacted. So when colonizers arrived, eager to classify everything in terms of commerce, they misunderstood spectacularly. To them, shells were quaint tokens of a primitive economy. But what they missed was that the shells weren't about buying and selling. They were about binding and haunting, and that misunderstanding would reshape encounters in ways both tragic and absurd. Europeans looked at a string of shells and saw pocket change. They gave it a name, wampum, money of savages, trinkets, and assumed it worked the same way as coins stamped with a king's face. This was a fatal misunderstanding. Colonizers barged into a symbolic economy with the bluntness of accountants, mistaking sacred contracts for currency and trying to buy land, labor, and loyalty with objects that were never meant to be commodities. To the people who held them, a belt of shells was a treaty itself, living proof of a promise. To the Europeans, it was just exotic jewelry with a market value. So while one side thought they were sealing an eternal pact, the other thought they were making a purchase. The gap between those interpretations was wide enough to swallow entire territories, which of course, it did. Treaties collapsed under the weight of mismatched expectations, leaving bitterness where shells once shimmered as trust. Worse still, colonizers began mass-producing shells. Factories in Europe churned out glass imitations, flooding networks that had once relied on rarity and careful circulation. The effect was corrosive. Objects once charged with ancestral weight became cheapened, their authority eaten away by industrial replication. The diplomatic heart of the shells was gutted, their silence drowned out by clattering machines. Yet even under assault, the symbolism didn't die. Communities continued to guard authentic belts and ornaments, reading in their patterns the agreements their ancestors had sworn, even when colonial law ignored them. In those shells survived a stubborn insistence that treaties are not written on paper alone, and that memory can outlast empire. And that survival leads to their strange afterlife, where even today, long after the factories have gone silent, shells still surface as claims, as heritage, as persistent reminders that alliances can be woven into matter. Even now, the shells refuse to vanish. They sit in museum cases, yes, stripped of the breath and bodies that once gave them life, but in many communities they are still taken out, touched, spoken to. They appear in ceremonies, not as quaint relics, but as living witnesses, reminders that agreements made centuries ago are not dead until the shells themselves crumble. And they don't crumble easily. Their endurance keeps memory alive, pressing into the present like a stubborn ghost. In legal disputes today, shells sometimes surface as evidence, not of property transactions, but of broken promises. A wampum belt, when unrolled, can still summon the authority of ancestors, the pattern of beads reminding everyone that the past is not closed. They resist translation into court documents, but their presence insists that history isn't only written in ink. Sometimes it's strung together in white and purple fragments, each bead carrying the weight of a word spoken long ago. The irony is sharp. What colonizers once dismissed as trinkets now return as arguments for sovereignty, as cultural anchors, stubborn proof that treaties never died, they were only ignored. In that sense, shells continue their old work, binding, accusing, reminding. They are still diplomats, though quieter than before, their voices muffled by glass cases and legal jargon. But when communities bring them back into ritual space, they regain their old shimmer. They gleam in firelight, they clink softly when moved, they draw silence around them. In that silence, one can almost hear the echo of the original exchanges, alliances sealed, enemies pacified, families joined. The shells, in their persistence, suggest that no treaty ever really ends. It only waits, coiled in a strand, to be remembered again. A belt made of shells could hold more words than any library of parchment in 17th century Europe, though it never needed ink. Each bead, drilled from clam or whelk, carried a fragment of a message. Together they formed sentences of color and geometry. To the uninitiated, it might have looked like nothing more than jewelry, purple against white, woven in neat rows. But for those trained in its grammar, it was a binding text. When a belt was brought out during council, the beads were not read with the eyes, but with the tongue. An elder would lift it, touch the patterned lines, and recite the agreement stitched into its very design. The words weren't improvised, they were remembered with the precision of liturgy. This is what made wampum so unsettling to outsiders, who assumed that only paper and gold could preserve meaning. A contract written in ink could be burned, a letter hidden, a royal seal forged. But a wampum belt came with breath, with performance, with collective memory. Its authority lay not just in what it displayed, but in who could speak it aloud. And that meant the belt was both archive and ceremony at once. Europeans found it difficult to counterfeit, not because the shells were rare, but because they were empty without the voices that animated them. Gold might survive the centuries untouched, but wampum endured only through repetition, retelling, the stubborn insistence of community, and that stubbornness is exactly what led to the next irony. The beads were precious not because they lasted forever, but because someone had to work so painfully long to bring even a handful of them into existence. Imagine trying to pierce a stone with another stone, over and over, knowing a single slip will split it to dust. That was the ordeal behind each wampum bead. The quahug clamshell was dense, stubborn, purple at the core, and dangerously sharp when broken. Whelk shells, used for the white beads, weren't much kinder. A bead the size of a fingernail could take hours to drill through using nothing more than bone, reed, or later, bits of metal scavenged from Europeans. Some workers would lose their eyesight straining at the task, others their fingers to infection from the dust. The craft was tedious and unglamorous, the kind of labor that left hands rough and lungs scarred. What emerged from that drudgery was not a trinket, but distilled time. Each string of wampum represented days of effort, and every belt, weeks, or even months. Gold, by comparison, could be scooped in heaps from a riverbed, melted down, and stamped into coins by hammer and die. Its value lay in quantity, in the sheer glittering pile. Wampum's value lay in patience. The bead itself was an accumulation of human endurance, as fragile as bone and yet worth more than metal precisely because it couldn't be rushed. And so, when belts circulated as trade or treaties, they carried with them the weight of invisible sweat and labor, the sense that nothing here was casual, nothing could be tossed away lightly. Which is why, when wampum began moving across vast trade routes, it wasn't treated like shiny pocket change, but like breath shared between distant villages, a currency woven out of exhaustion as much as ceremony. That circulation is where its story swells next. Long before the jangle of coins-filled purses, wampum was already sliding across rivers and forests in networks that made gold look provincial. Strands of beads moved from the Atlantic coast deep into the interior, carried by traders in canoes and on foot, exchanged for furs, maize, tobacco, and tools. No king stamped his face on them, no mint set their value. Their legitimacy came from recognition, from centuries of circulation that taught both giver and receiver what the colors meant, how many strings counted as fair, and and when a belt was too sacred to be priced at all. What startled European newcomers was how effective this shell economy already was. Colonists, desperate for something that would pass as money in a cash-starved wilderness, adopted wampum as legal tender in some regions. For a time, debts and taxes in New England could be paid, not with sterling, but with strings of purple and white. Gold, hoarded in London vaults, was too distant to serve frontier markets. Wampum, by contrast, was present, flexible, and widely understood. But wampum was never just a stand-in for coins. Every exchange carried a trace of obligation, a thread of kinship. Giving a string was not the same as handing over a shilling. It implied relationship, continuity, an agreement to remember. In that way, trade was inseparable from diplomacy. Shells crossed hands, not only to seal bargains, but to stitch bonds, and the line between market and council fire blurred until it was almost invisible. Out of this blur grew a deeper role, one that reached beyond barter and into the highest stakes of peace and war. When a wampum belt entered a council, the air itself seemed to shift. Delegates didn't simply lay it down like a purse of coins. They lifted it, presented it, and spoke through it. Each row of beads carried the weight of a promise, a peace agreed, a path of trade opened, a grievance settled. To refuse the belt was to refuse the relationship itself. To accept it was to bind oneself, not just to the other party, but to the memory of the belt, which would surface again whenever the agreement was recalled. Unlike parchment treaties, which could be hidden in archives or ignored by those who never signed them, wampum was designed to be public, performative, and sacred. Belts were displayed at subsequent councils to remind all present of the words previously spoken. They didn't merely record peace, they enacted it, with every bead a syllable in the ongoing recitation of obligations. To break such an agreement wasn't just political betrayal, it was sacrilege, an offense against the material witness that had absorbed the oath. European negotiators often underestimated this. They treated belts as quaint tokens of goodwill, souvenirs to pack away. But for the communities who wove them, they were living contracts. A gold coin could buy a soldier. A wampum belt could stop a war. That distinction mattered because it showed that shells, fragile as they were, could carry a moral authority that metal never achieved. And that authority spread beyond councils into daily life, shaping kinship, mourning, and marriage, weaving shells into the very fabric of human relationship. Wampum didn't accumulate in chests, it accumulated in lives. A string of beads could be given to mark a marriage, to console a bereaved family, or to seal the adoption of outsiders into a clan. In each case, the shell wasn't a price tag, it was a visible thread tying one body of people to another. Where gold encouraged hoarding and hierarchy, wampum encouraged circulation, obligation, and reciprocity. Its value was measured not in how much one possessed, but in how much one gave away. At funerals, belts were presented to soothe grief, acknowledging that loss couldn't be erased but had to be honored. At weddings, they were exchanged to weave new households into existing networks. In councils, they reminded speakers that their words carried the weight of collective memory. To remove wampum from this relational web was to strip it of meaning, like trying to spend a wedding ring as if it were loose metal. This is why, when Europeans arrived and tried to tally shells in ledgers, they always missed the point. They saw currency where there was covenant, wealth where there was weaving. For them, gold was inert treasure, waiting in vaults. For those who shaped wampum, the beads never sat idle. They moved, they bound, they reminded. But of course, that misunderstanding would lead to trouble, because once Europeans realized these shells could pass for money, they began to copy them, to mass-produce them, and in doing so they altered the economy of trust itself. When Europeans finally grasped that wampum could oil the gears of trade, their first instinct was not reverence, but replication. Dutch traders brought in drills made of iron, and later factories in Europe churned out glass and shell beads by the barrel. What once took hours of aching hands and careful breath could now be stamped out by the thousands. To colonists, this was efficiency. To indigenous communities, it was inflation by desecration. The sudden flood of cheap beads disrupted the balance that had made wampum precious. Where every strand once carried the ghost of labor, now traders could present strings spun from factory dust, stripped of sweat and ritual. Colonists tried to pass them off as equal, but they lacked the aura of work, the lived patience that made real wampum sacred. Belts woven from these counterfeit beads might glitter, but they were hollow. They recorded nothing. They spoke no words. They carried no memory. Yet even as their economic value collapsed under European interference, the symbolic authority of wampum refused to vanish. Councils still required belts. Treaties still invoked them. Colonists could counterfeit the shells, but they couldn't counterfeit the ceremony. They could mass-produce beads, but they couldn't mass-produce trust. And in that split between shells as commodity and shells as covenant, wampum's deeper role became unmistakable. It wasn't just an economy of objects. It was a constitution of memory, a legal code without parchment. Among the Haudenosaunee belts were not trinkets, but the very spine of law. The great law of peace, a confederacy binding 5 nations and later 6, wasn't written in ink or stone. It was woven into wampum. Each belt marked a clause, a principle, a collective decision, carried not in dusty archives, but in the hands of trained keepers who could read the patterns aloud. These belts were displayed at councils like volumes on a shelf, except their pages had to be spoken to exist. The system was sophisticated enough to make European lawyers squirm. A belt could recall the conditions of unity, the protocols for succession, the obligations of leaders to their people. To misremember was unthinkable. The beads held the authority to correct the speaker. In a sense, the Constitution was both material and oral, an archive that lived only when performed. Gold could buy silence, but wampum demanded speech, demanded accountability to the past. What unnerved outsiders was how resilient this system was. Paper could be forged, burned, or simply ignored by those in power, but a belt, recited in front of witnesses, was not so easily erased. Its authority lay in collective memory, and no colonial decree could annul that. Wampum proved that law didn't need parchment to endure. It only needed a rhythm of repetition, a willingness to keep the past alive bead by bead. And behind those beads, beyond their political use, lay a symbolic depth that reached even further out of law and into cosmology. The beads weren't just pretty shells. They were fragments of the world, cut and drilled until they could speak. White came from the whelk, a spiral pulled from the ocean's edge, gleaming with the color of dawn and purity. Purple came from the quahog, clam, hidden in the cold Atlantic mud, dark as twilight, marked by laborious extraction. Side by side, the two shades weren't merely decorative, they enacted a balance, the duality of light and shadow, sea and shore, life and death. When belts were woven, they mirrored this cosmic tension. A line of white beads might symbolize clarity, truth spoken plainly, while purple signified solemnity, grief, or the gravity of binding promises. The interplay of colors wasn't arbitrary design, but an echo of the universe, the way sky meets water, the way night follows day. To wear or present wampum was to hold a piece of that order in one's hands, a reminder that human words only mattered if they harmonized with the broader rhythm of existence. Gold had none of this resonance. It glittered, yes, but its shine was mute, divorced from dualities, stripped of relationship. Wampum, fragile as it was, carried cosmology on its surface. And yet, fragility was not a weakness here. It was precisely what made it powerful. The same breakable shell that could hold the balance of the cosmos could also remind people that every agreement, every alliance, was as delicate as the beads themselves. Wampum was powerful precisely because it could break. A strand might snap with too much tension. A bead might shatter under careless fingers. That vulnerability was never hidden. It was embraced. Fragility mirrored the nature of the promises themselves. Alliances could fracture. Kinship could falter. Peace could dissolve, if not constantly cared for. The beads didn't let anyone forget that relationships require maintenance, the way a cracked shell requires mending or replacement. This delicacy gave wampum a different kind of weight than gold. Gold's allure lies in permanence. It doesn't tarnish. It doesn't rust. It survives burial and fire. But permanence can be deceptive. It tempts people to believe their agreements are indestructible, immune to time. Wampum carried the opposite lesson. Its very brittleness was a reminder that bonds are fragile, that words must be repeated, that care must be constant. A belt wasn't proof that peace had been achieved forever. It was a reminder that peace must be tended, or else it would splinter like a dropped bead. This paradox value through breakability is what allowed wampum to survive even after its collapse as a recognized currency. Once Europeans drowned it in factory-made counterfeits, the beads lost their market price, but their fragility still carried meaning, and their authority didn't vanish with economics. It shifted, it lingered, it adapted, so that even now, centuries later, wampum holds a presence in ceremonies and councils where gold has nothing to say. Even after the markets abandoned it, wampum never retired quietly. Belts remained in longhouses, brought out during ceremonies, councils, and commemorations, still recited bead by bead. They marked treaties that colonial governments would prefer to forget, yet the belts insist on their own endurance, speaking across centuries. In courtrooms today, some indigenous leaders still present wampum to remind states that a promise woven in shell cannot be annulled by paper. Fragile as they are, the beads outlive the ink of colonial decrees. What's striking is how gold, for all its permanence, rarely carries such living presence. A gold coin from the 17th century sits behind glass in a museum, stripped of use, admired for its weight, but emptied of voice. A wampum belt of the same age, even if cracked or incomplete, can still enter a council and speak law. It can still bind the present to the past, demanding recognition. Its authority isn't trapped in the material, but in the memory it continues to call forth. So wampum was never simply worth more than gold because it was rarer or harder to make. Its worth came from being alive, from being fragile and yet insistent, from being a vessel of promises that refused to die. And while gold still dazzles bankers and vaults, wampum remains where it began, in ceremony, in relationship, in the slow breath of memory that will not let itself be silenced.